Welcome to the Story Learning Podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. Okay, thank you very much for joining me today. If you are new here, welcome. This is where we talk about language learning and learning languages in efficient ways. Please subscribe to the show so that you get future episodes delivered straight to your listening device, whatever that may be. And all right, today's question has got me so excited that I'm just going to get straight into it, I think, because it is right up my alley in more ways than one. Okay, here's today's question, all the way from Japan.
Hi, Ollie. My name's Simon Robinson, and I live in Japan, where I teach English at university, and I'm also a keen student of Japanese. I'm a fairly advanced student. I have the JPLT EQ, and I'm really working now on developing up to a native-like competence. And I've been doing a lot of listening, an incredible amount of listening, about 5 hours a day, and I'm really feeling the benefit. And I want to bring this to my students. I teach English at university, and I also teach once a week a Japanese class to beginner speakers of Japanese. And I'm wondering, I'm very interested in your storylines, your storytelling methodology. But I had a look, and you don't have a story course for either Japanese or English, the two languages I teach. So I started thinking about this, and what I've been experimenting with is bringing anecdotes and just kind of telling a little anecdote and seeing how much the students can get from it as I repeat. And then I'm thinking perhaps to have a kind of list of vocab items and a list of grammar sort of sentence patterns I want to cover, and just kind of crossing them off, not in any particular order, but just to kind of make sure I'm covering all the bases. And I'm wondering what you think of that as an idea for teaching beginners in a language where there isn't a story course of yours. Thanks very much for any advice you have.
Simon, thank you very much for your question. It's great to get questions like this because what you've asked here is pretty much what I spend my days thinking about. You know, you're right that we don't have yet a Japanese uncovered course, although, trust me, it's not for want of trying or thinking about it. It's very important for me that we get these things right. And you know, the issue with the two Asian languages that I tend to deal with here on in my website, which are Chinese and Japanese, is that you've got a significant jump in difficulty from the Romance languages up to Japanese, you know, in many different respects. The language itself, and the distance from English, you've got the writing system, etc., etc. And so I don't know yet, I'm not convinced yet whether the particular format that we have for our uncovered courses will kind of will map on well enough to Japanese and Chinese. It's something that I'm kind of thinking through. Having said that, we do have the Conversations course for Japanese, which of course is not suitable for beginners. And I do also have a book of English short stories for intermediate level, which you can find on Amazon, which, I don't know, maybe your students. Very popular in Japan, actually, that book, funnily enough. But we are also developing out a book of Japanese and Chinese short stories for beginners, but that's going to be at least a year away, so not much immediate use for you. Okay, so that's me, I guess, pitching my stuff. So I'll stop now and get to your question, which is, well, let me summarize the question back to you. You know, actually, when I was recording this episode, I kind of actually was really tempted to plan out a big kind of elaborate answer, because there's so much to say about this topic that I wanted to make sure I did it justice. But the trouble is that this topic about storytelling and language learning is something that really, the only way I can do it justice is by writing a book on it. So what I decided to do instead was just hit record and kind of talk off the cuff. I'm trying to react to the various things you said and getting my thoughts out. So it might be a bit rambly, but hopefully this is the most efficient way of kind of replying and not spending a year to do so. So first of all, I think that the you know, if we're talking about teaching Japanese to beginner English learners, or rather teaching Japanese as a foreign language to beginners who are native English speakers, which I think is what you're getting at. First of all, I mean, I think it's great that you're doing that. Not least because, having lived in Japan and taken classes in Japan, if we were to generalize about the Japanese approach to teaching Japanese to foreigners, it's pretty antiquated and not the best, in my opinion, in my humble but accurate opinion. And so I think that bringing more, holistic approaches to the task, namely storytelling, I think is a fantastic thing. And so, good for you for doing it. It must also be really, really rewarding. So let's try and work through these issues one by one. So firstly, stories or anecdotes as the material or the kind of engine of the teaching. I think it's kind of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, to be completely honest. I mean, a story can be in itself a collection of anecdotes. And within a story, for example, the story that we use, The Man in the Hat, which is the story that we use for the Uncovered courses that we have in Spanish and German and Italian in development, is, one of the things that we're careful to do is to fuse narrative with dialogue so that it's not just descriptive stuff, which isn't always immediately practical and practically useful for people. It's also a lot of dialogue, so people speaking, because it's the dialogue in stories which I think often get missed. And when you have plenty of dialogue within stories, that gives people kind of raw material to actually take and use in their own speaking. So, anecdotes, anecdotes are stories. Lots of things out there are stories. If you watch a soap opera on TV, or you overhear the neighbors gossiping, or someone tells you what happened today, like these are all stories of different kinds. And the things that stories have in common is that, all these different mediums have in common is that they're all based on the overarching concept of storytelling, which is what we have, as humans, have been using for millennia to communicate. From the first cave drawings, where people depicted basic things happening. We are hardwired as humans to react, relate to, understand, remember stories. And so as a medium, I don't think it matters really whether it's an anecdote or a story. Now, of course, in general, you're going to want to try to link them up. So if we move, if you conceive of your Japanese classes as a potential series of anecdotes, then there are ways to elevate that to the next level. So if there is a connection from one anecdote to the next, that's obviously better, because one of the opportunities you have in storytelling is that of continuity. If you have the same characters, then you get used to, you get an attachment to that character. The characters tend to talk in similar ways and repeat certain vocabulary, which is useful for as a learning tool. Also, when you've got a storyline and a plot, then that enables you to do things like open loops within the narrative, which creates curiosity, and then that raises the student's motivation, because then they want to come back and find out what happened next, which is the whole basis of TV series. They always end on a cliffhanger. Why? Because you can't stop thinking about it, and you have to come back next week to find out what happened. So you can try to think of your anecdotes as part of a longer narrative, perhaps. And the thing about anecdotes is they don't necessarily have to be true. They can be based on truth if you want, or you can kind of make them fictional and you could tell your students stories about little anecdotes about things that happens to you in Japan over the years, and weave it into a particular story. So the story might not be true, but the anecdotes themselves are based on fact. So little things that you can do to kind of provide some sense of structure serves to do something very, very important, which is to motivate and interest and captivate the students as much as possible. And we can't underestimate the importance of motivation in language learning. So that's the first point, which then brings us logically, neatly onto the question of language and how do you structure the actual language content. Now, as trained teachers, Simon, we've been indoctrinated in the whole idea of a structural syllabus, right? So, which is to say that the teaching tends to be organized around grammar points. So pretty much any language learning syllabus you look at will tell you what you're going to learn by presenting you a series of grammar points that are covered in the course. But of course, you don't have to go far in the learning literature to understand that that is not how languages are learned. If you want to look at this more, you can look at the natural order hypothesis to show that it doesn't matter what order a teacher tries to teach you grammar points in, you will learn those grammar points in the order that your brain wants, and there's not much you can do about it. So, I'm very much of the opinion that grammar should be learnt naturally as a result and as a consequence of exposure to the language. And from your message, Simon, I can kind of gather that you are pretty much of the same opinion, because you've talked about having a rough idea of the language points or the grammar points that you want to introduce through the anecdotes. But the fact that you're not totally committed to that, or even particularly bothered by it, I think is a very good sign that you're going in the right direction. Because I think the trouble is that as soon as you start to think in that way, as soon as you start to try to organize your material by grammar, you just start to get kind of wedged into a corner and that leads to a series of decisions, which I think pretty inevitably lead you away from the true nature of the storytelling. And so, in my Uncovered courses, for example, what I try to do, the way that I designed the courses, was grammar was, we do teach grammar in the courses, but it's done retrospectively. Everything works in service of the storyline. So we don't write the story based on the grammar points we want to teach. We write the story first, and then we look at the story and say, okay, where are the opportunities for teaching grammar within the story? And we have to do that in a fairly structured way because it's online courses, which are obviously pre-recorded, right? So as a teacher teaching live classes, the opportunity that you've got is to actually teach in a much more reactive way. So you can teach grammar as it emerges from the story and the student's reaction. I'm a big fan of the Unplugged or Dogme language, sort of school of language learning. Scott Thornbury, Luke Meddings, I'm sure you're familiar with those guys, Simon. And again, it's a real emphasis and focus on holistic learning. So I wouldn't really worry about the grammar at all. I mean, if you're going to struggle not to have it in your head as a trained teacher, of course. But as a starting point, I think that it's a very helpful experiment to actually set about this kind of thing without worrying about the grammar at all, just to have the confidence to get started and see what emerges. Because with the thing about storytelling is that the students will tell you and will guide you through the lesson based on their own interest and based on their reactions to the story, which kind of leads us to the next point, which is reactions. Now, you're telling an anecdote to the students, and obviously you're going to do a good job, I'm sure, of making those anecdotes entertaining and relevant to those students. But the key element, the key ingredient in what happens is the students' reactions, and this is something that is a key part of TPRS, which is teaching languages through teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. It's an approach to teaching that's popular in the US. And I'll put links to all these in the show notes, by the way. And one of the things that they emphasize is the fact that, so storytelling is done in the classroom, but a key part of it, as I understand at least, is in the reactions of the students. So, you ask, an obvious question might be, well, if I'm telling an anecdote to beginner students, how are they going to learn? How do they learn from my anecdotes? Well, obviously, you've got to make it comprehensible as a starting point. So you can't tell anecdotes about your nuclear physics PhD. You've got to tell anecdotes about, I went to the shop and this is what happened. You've got to grade the language to their level. You've got to offer them comprehensible input. But the way that they learn is by engaging with you in the storyline. So you can ask comprehension checking questions to see if they're following the story. You can ask for their reactions, in the fashion of, well, what do you think happened next? Or, would you like that if that happened to you? Or do you remember that person's name? These kind of questions elicit things from the students that guide you to kind of assess, well, have they understood it? And if so, how well? And then from there, you kind of adapt your teaching. I think that, for me, this is the gold standard in teaching. Because what happens then, if you are doing this on a regular basis, day in, day out, or at least lesson in, lesson out, then the students are it doesn't matter whether you've thought through the grammar or not, because what they're going to end up getting is a very, very good general overview of an exposure to the Japanese language. And I simply wouldn't, in that environment, I wouldn't care if we could, specify the exact vocabulary and grammar points that they've learned, because everything that they've learned is going to be useful. And if certain linguistic needs emerge as a result of that activity, well, fine, and teach stuff. There's always the scope and the room to teach stuff as it comes up. The thing that makes this approach on the whole so challenging is that it really relies on the skill of the teacher. You've got to be a very confident, insightful, agile teacher to pull this off. So for an experienced teacher, I think that is precisely what makes it so fun, because you're free from the constraints of what I imagine you'd have to stick to in a university environment, Simon, for example, in your own case. And certainly I remember from my teaching days that really the best, the things that I remember most about teaching that were so kind of liberating and gratifying were when you were free to just follow the needs of the students without worrying about what was on the syllabus. So, wow. I think that's probably all I've got for now. I could go on, but those are the main points, unless I've missed anything massive from your question. So I hope that was that's giving you some food for thought. Again, as I was listening to your question, Simon, I kind of get the idea that you are working through these ideas in your head as well. And I think the proof is in the pudding, really. I would just dive in and get started and have the courage to talk to you, to try this out, and also explain to your students what you're doing. I'd probably, if I had a new class of students, I would sit down and actually tell them how I intend to teach them, so that they're on board and they're not thinking, because if your students are sort of sitting there thinking, well, where are the grammar exercises? Then they're not, and they haven't bought into the concept, then you're kind of limiting how effective it could be. So talk to them, explain to them what you're doing, get some buy-in to the teaching approach, and then they will be on board, and they'll feel safe in that classroom environment as well. There's so much stuff I could go on for hours here, but I'm gonna call it a day. Simon, thank you so much for your question. Please feel free to leave a comment on the episode, on the show notes, to continue pick up on any theme that you would like. The show notes will be at iwillteachyourlanguage.com/episode 270. I'll also put a link to many of the things that I've mentioned in this episode in the show notes, so you can follow up any areas of interest. Thanks for listening. I'm not going to give you any recommended resources, as I usually do, because I've just mentioned about 1,000 of them. So go and check out the show notes to follow up on some of these ideas and themes that I've mentioned. iwillteachyourlanguage.com/episode 270. Thank you, Simon, for your question. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Thanks also for bearing with me in this episode, because I'm sure it's some of these things might not be so relevant to you guys. But anyway, it is what it is. See you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. And here at Story Learning, everything that I do is powered by stories, whether that's writing books, teaching lessons, crafting courses. My mission is to help everyone succeed at learning a new language through the power of story. And we now have comprehensive language courses in over 15 languages, from Spanish to French, Korean to Japanese, and across all levels from beginner to mastery. And you can take a 7-day free trial of any of these programs by visiting storylearning.com/courses. I've poured my heart and soul into creating these courses over the last 10 or so years, and we've helped tens of thousands of new students achieve their dreams of learning a new language, all through the power of story. So go ahead and take a free trial. There's no commitment. You can try out our method for free. See if this can also be the breakthrough for you that it's been for so many other people. storylearning.com/courses.